Criminal Justice Reform by David Moraine. What is criminal justice reform? Criminal justice reform is the goal of trying to fix many errors within the criminal justice system. For example, reducing the amount of time a person must serve for drug sentencing. The biggest problem, one of, if not the biggest problem with our current criminal justice system, is our prisons. The United States has over 25% of people incarcerated throughout the world, but only has 5% of the world's population. Overcrowding. Some of the biggest advocates for reform in our system state that there is a dire need to change our system. Many of our prisons in the United States are ran by the states and paid for by the taxpayers. Overcrowding. This means while there's people serving a sentence for having drugs on them, for example, there are other people in need of help over someone that doesn't overly need to be occupying a space in prison. For example, there are many homeless veterans who wander the streets. Instead of using taxpayer money to help them find a job, we allocate more money to go towards the person that is in jail, while they could be out working and being a taxpayer. Statistics. More than 1 out of 100 Americans are behind bars. More than 2 million Americans incarcerated today are nonviolent offenders. African American men are 4 times more likely to be stopped by police and sentenced to longer prison terms than white men found guilty of the same charge. Between 1980 and 2015, the number of people incarcerated in America increased from roughly 500,000 to over 2.2 million people. Statistics. Today, the United States makes up about 5% of the world's population and has 25% of the world's prisoners. 1 in every 37 adults in the United States, or 2.7% of the adult population, is under some form of correctional supervision. In 2014, African Americans constituted 2.3 million, or 34% of the total 6.8 million correctional population. The imprisonment rate for African American women is twice that of white women. Nationwide, African American children represent 32% of children who are arrested, 42% of children who are detained, and 52% of children whose cases are judicially waived to criminal court. Drug sentencing disparities. In the 2015 National Survey on Drug Use and Health, about 17 million whites and 4 million African Americans reported having used an illicit drug within the last month. African Americans and whites use drug at similar rates, but the imprisonment rate of African Americans for drug charges is almost 6 times that of whites. African Americans represent 12.5% of illicit drug users, but 29% of those arrested for drug offenses and 33% of those incarcerated in state facilities for drug offenses. Effects of incarceration. A criminal record can reduce the likelihood of a callback or job offer by nearly 50%. The negative impact of a criminal record is twice as large for African American applicants. Infectious diseases are highly concentrated in correctional facilities. 15% of jail inmates and 22% of prisoners, compared to 5% of the general population, reported ever having tuberculosis, hepatitis B and C, HIV, AIDS, or other STDs. In 2012 alone, the United States spent nearly $81 billion on corrections. Spending on prisons and jails has increased at triple the rate of spending on pre-K through 12 public education in the last 30 years. Continued. Approximately 95% of incarcerated individuals are eventually released into local communities nationwide. Nearly half of black males and almost 40% of white males are arrested by the time they are 23 years old. As of 2007, more than half of those incarcerated were parents of children under the age of 18. The number of Americans with criminal records is about the same as the number of Americans with a 4-year degree. Although illicit drug use is approximately the same for African Americans as it is for white people, African Americans are much more likely to be arrested for drug use. The cost of imprisonment. Taking into account the above considerations, it is essential to note that, when considering the cost of imprisonment, account needs to be taken not only of the actual funds spent on the upkeep of each prisoner, which is usually significantly higher than what is spent on a person's sentence, to non-custodial sanctions, but also of the indirect costs, such as the social, economic, and healthcare related costs, which are difficult to measure, but which are immense and long-term. Detrimental and social impact. Imprisonment disrupts relationships and weakens social cohesion. Since the maintenance of such cohesion is based on long-term relationships, when a member of a family is in prison, the disruption of the family structure affects relationships between spouses as well as between parents and children, reshaping the family and community across generations. Mass imprisonment produces a deep social transformation in families and communities. Imprisonment and poverty. Imprisonment disproportionately affects individuals and families living in poverty. When an income generation member of the family is imprisoned, the rest of the family must adjust to this loss of income. The impact can be especially severe in poor, developing countries, where the state does not provide financial assistance to the indigent and where it is not unusual for one breadwinner to financially support an extended family network. Thus, the family experiences financial losses as a result of the imprisonment of one of its members, exacerbated by the new expenses that must be met, such as the cost of a lawyer, food for the imprisoned person, transport to prison for visits, and so on. When released, often with no prospects for employment, former prisoners are generally subject to socioeconomic exclusion and are thus vulnerable to an endless cycle of poverty, marginalization, criminality, and imprisonment. Thus, imprisonment contributes directly to the impoverishment of the prisoner, of his family, with a significant cross-generational effect, and of society by creating future victims and reducing future potential economic performance. Although prison issues directly affect only the small percentage of American citizens who are incarcerated, the conditions of the prison systems have broader implications for the United States. The construction and administration of prisons in the 21st century cost the government and taxpayers tens of billions of dollars annually. The amount spent on prisons by most states rises each year, while in numerous states the amount spent on education has declined. In addition, strict penalties for crimes affect more than just those convicted. Such punishments impact the family members left behind who struggle emotionally and financially in the prisoner's absence. A failure to reduce crime rates effectively, including the crimes committed by those who have already been in prison and have not been rehabilitated, also affects the larger society. Human rights considerations. A sentence of imprisonment constitutes only a deprivation of the basic right to liberty. It does not entail the restriction of other human rights, with the exception of those which are naturally restricted by the very fact of being in prison. Prison reform is necessary to ensure that this principle is respected, the human rights of prisoners protected, and their prospects for social reintegration increased, in compliance with relevant international standards and norms. Criminal records and employment. Finding stable employment is crucial to ensuring that individuals do not reoffend. Having a record reduces the likelihood of a job callback or offer by as much as 50%. White men with a criminal record are more likely to get an interview than black men with no criminal record. Reduced employment for the millions of people with records cost America $78 to $87 billion each year. Prison reform. Prison reform is one remedy to the ineffectiveness of our justice system that many states and the federal government have explored. Prison reform is focused on ensuring public safety and restoration for those impacted by crime through the creation of a constructive culture within our prison system. These reforms seek to alter the circumstances of incarceration in ways that allow the system to model and incentivize the attitudes, behaviors, and lifestyles conducive to personal responsibility and self-control. Prison reform programs. Mental health support in prison was found to reduce misconduct incidents by 22%. Substance abuse treatment in one California prison resulted in a 48% reduction in reincarnation. One holistic faith-based program reduced future reincarnation by 40% for those who graduate the program. Educational classes. Educational and vocational classes have been studied extensively and found to be some of the most effective programs in prison reform. Research shows that these types of programs reduce recidivism by 13%, reduce incident reports for prisoner misconduct by 4%, and increase post-release employment by 13%. Every taxpayer dollar spent on educational and vocational training programs for prisoners saves $5 on law enforcement and corrections expenditures in the future. Support. Individuals who are incarcerated have children, spouses, family, and friends who desire to continue a relationship with them while they are in prison. Incarceration makes it exceptionally difficult for individuals to maintain healthy relationships with those who will be their support system when they return home. It is estimated that there are more than 2.7 million children who have parents in state and federal prisons. Many of these parents were the sole caretaker for these children before they were incarcerated. Importance of prison reform in America. Though America's correctional system has grown at an alarming rate, it has reached a state of diminishing marginal returns when it comes to deterring future crime and increasing public safety. Prison reform seeks to change the status quo by providing individuals with a constructive and dignified experience while they are incarcerated and provides access to tools to transform their lives. By ensuring that individuals have the opportunity to use their time incarcerated in a constructive manner and allowing them to maintain positive relationships with their support network, we can increase the likelihood they become productive members of their communities upon re-entry. Prison reform attempts to achieve these goals on the path to increase public safety by expanding prison programming and ensuring adequate prison visitation policies. Solutions. One of the biggest solutions to help reform our criminal justice system is to change the laws regarding drugs. For example, it would be beneficial to get rid of the felony charge of so many grams of cannabis in Kansas and instead sentence that person to community service and also having to pay a fine. This would drastically cut back on the amount of people that are in prisons because of felony drug charges such as the intent to sell. This would cut down on the financial burden to taxpayers for prisons and at the same time would make the community a better place because of the community service hours. People in these situations could also have the option to attend free classes to educate themselves on how to better themselves. Ban the box. Another great solution that is already taking place is a campaign called Ban the Box. It is a campaign that makes it illegal for employers to remove from their hiring process the box that asks them if they have a criminal record. This would greatly help because it would allow ex-offenders to get a real job and not have to go back to doing illegal activities in order to make ends meet. This also gives the chance for well-qualified ex-offenders to not get passed up to do a non-ex-offender who's not as qualified but would otherwise get the job because they don't have a criminal record. Ban the box delays consideration of criminal records, but it does not prohibit employers from asking about criminal records later in the employment process. More than 25 states and 150 local areas have adopted ban the box laws and policies. In 9 states, ban the box laws apply to private employers. Studies on public sector ban-the-box laws and policies have found that ban-the-box increases opportunities for individuals with criminal records. Expanding and improving problem-solving courts. Georgia funded an $11.6 million expansion of its problem-solving courts. These courts work with arrestees whose needs may not be fully met in a traditional court. Like offenders with drug abuse problems or a history of mental illness, working closely with arrestees, the courts come up with less adversarial solutions than traditional prison sentences that benefit the offender and the broader community. Making decisions based on risks. Recently, Ohio passed legislation requiring the use of a standard set of risk assessment tools across its community correctional system. These tools help predict an offender's criminal risk factors and the likelihood that they'll reoffend. They also provide correction staff with a data-driven method to help decide who can be safely released into supervision or other alternative programs. Strengthening community-based treatment programs. Georgia invested $5.7 million into residential substance abuse treatment programs. Community-based treatment programs can help offenders become self-sufficient, healthy, contributing members of society, and can reduce their likelihood of reoffending. Responding swiftly to technical violations. Arkansas, Kentucky, South Dakota, and several other states are testing a program for prohibitioners that combines swift and certain punishment with drug testing. Short jail stays along with other sanctions can serve a more effective alternative to long-term reincarceration for those who violate their parole or probation. These states gave probation officers meaningful and less costly options to use as consequences for violators. Sentenced prisoners. Many persons who have been sentenced to prison do not represent a real danger or threat to the community. The court has ordered them imprisoned because few other meaningful alternatives for punishment exist. Effective alternatives can be used to reduce the prison population. Convene a meeting with judges, politicians, community leaders, lawyers, and other relevant groups to discuss the use of alternative community-based punishments rather than prisons for non-dangerous offenders. Consider holding the meeting at the jail or prison to expand awareness of the concluding thoughts. By implementing some of these ideas, not only would it benefit the offender, it would also benefit the community, the workplace, the taxpayer, and the family of the offender. The overcrowding problem in the United States can be simply changed by changing the way we view nonviolent offenders and by sentencing them to simpler and more effective ways of service, such as community service and educating offenders.